Good afternoon, everybody. I am Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Mellon Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our event, American Monuments, American Cities. I would like to begin by inviting you all to continue to say hello in the chat. The chat is rolling and scrolling from all over the place, and it is so wonderful being able to know that you all are out there and where you're watching from and what you care about, and if you have any questions for our speakers this afternoon. We love to see lots of audience engagement in the chat throughout the program and the greater exchange and conversation that the chat supports. So today we are looking forward to a discussion on the future of monuments and memorials in cities throughout the United States. It is through commemorative work standing in civic spaces like parks, plazas, and promenades that we often come together to learn, question, and celebrate the various aspects of our American stories. And it's because of their prominence in these spaces that many cities are assessing which monuments should and should not have a place on their streets. These civic communities are asking questions about how our stories could be told more fully and more accurately in the years ahead. They are determining what we can do to make sure that our monuments best reflect who we have been, who we are now, and who we aim to become. We see folks who are making decisions about the future of American monuments and American cities, recognizing the deep and enduring community engagement processes that monuments in civic spaces require. Mellon recently issued $25 million in grants as part of our Monuments Project, our biggest initiative in Mellon's history, to cities and municipalities across the country, including in this round, Boston and Columbus, Chicago and Los Angeles, Providence, Denver and Asheville, Portland and San Francisco. The goal is not only to fund new monuments, but also to support new forms of public education and interaction with the American commemorative landscape. So, joining us today for a juicy discussion on the future of monuments in our civic spaces are our four guest speakers, two of whom are artists, one with a background in cognitive science and computer science, blending technology and the material world, one trained as an architect, working at the intersection of race and the built environment, a leading urbanist who has initiated and led numerous projects to make our cities better places to live and work, and a journalist who has thought deeply and written about the question of monuments. Those guests are Idris Brewster, Amanda Williams, Carol Coletta, and Carolina A. Miranda. Idris Brewster is and there you are. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you. Hello. Idris Brewster is a co-founder and executive director of Kinfolk, an augmented reality archive and educational technology nonprofit that reveals and celebrates underrepresented historical events and figures in our public spaces. With expertise in both digital art and computer science, he and the Kinfolk team are expanding opportunities for those living in cities to better understand and experience undertold stories that are present in their communities. Amanda Williams is a visionary artist and architect who exposes the complex ways that race informs how we assign cultural and economic value to the spaces we occupy. Her work has been exhibited at many venues, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Venice Architecture Biennale. And among many other honors, she is a recent recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. Carol Coletta is CEO of the Memphis River Parks Partnership, leading the relaunch of a nonprofit to develop, manage, and program 6 miles of riverfront and 5 park districts along the Mississippi River. Prior to this work, she held leadership roles at the Kresge and Knight Foundations, served as executive director of the Mayor's Institute on City Design, led the startup of Art Place, and was president and CEO of CEOs for City. And Carolina A. Miranda is a Los Angeles Times columnist focused on art and design, who often reports on the intersection of art and race and how communities are rethinking the nature of monuments, as well as how architecture is shifting to accommodate a denser Los Angeles. Among other outlets, her work has also appeared in Fast Company, Time, Art News, and NPR's All Things Considered. She is a past winner of the Rabkin Prize in Visual Arts Journalism and is founding co-chair of the Los Angeles Times Guild, the first newspaper union in the paper's 140-year existence. Idris, Amanda, Carol, and Carolina, we welcome you. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon to everybody across the time zones. So we are going to start with Amanda, and since we have a beautiful group of four, I will call on you by name, even as we're or we may just have a free for all. Let's see how it goes. But I will try to direct traffic as we start. So, Ms. Williams, I would like to begin our conversation by asking you, as I'll ask the others, to set the scene of the question, the importance of monuments in our cities. Why do monuments matter in civic spaces? What do they bring to city communities that other elements of the built environment do not?
Great question. I think I never really thought about that until we kind of had a collective existential crisis, if you will, during the pandemic. And obviously we'd seen protests and reactions to monuments. But I think at that moment, for me, it really did both ring true as a moment to tell stories in a different way, when we could get in cars and only drive around remotely. I have two younger daughters. And for me, it was really telling that all of a sudden these things they never noticed, because usually they're humans moving around, were really important. Mm-hmm. And then where are the things that look like me? Or why is that story important? Or what is the identity of this place I call home? I live in Chicago. What's the relationship of that thing? And so I think in that more traditional sense of these monuments that are representational, they send messages that you either belong or you don't belong, or they become validations of stories that you need to hold on to believe that you're important, or reinforce that you're not really important because apparently you've done nothing in history that matters, or there's nothing that commemorates. And I also think I'm reaching a certain age. I'm realizing that things that I saw go away, I know they were there. And so I have a connection to those things, or I have pride about a place that now younger generations don't. And so a lot of the head scratching we're doing about why there might be a lack of respect in public place, or a lack of civic discourse around certain things, it's because we're starting to reach a population point where more people than not can't remember these things unless there is something to remind them, or to complicate what we see now in government, an active attempt to erase everything. So these things become really important again in a way that they didn't feel important to me when I was growing up. It's like, I don't know who that dude is. I don't really care. I know who I am. I'm fine. And I think the landscape is changing in terms of our realization of what these messages are, these unspoken messages about these objects.
Thank you. Carolina, why do monuments matter in civic spaces, and what do they bring that other elements of the built environment do not?
I mean, I think I definitely co-sign on what Amanda said, and she said it so beautifully. I think, they can articulate these in their most idealist state, this sense of shared history and shared narrative. But I think what's interesting about these spaces to me, as somebody who also writes about like architecture and urban design, is that they are ultimately, in many cases, public spaces. And that sometimes those public spaces can become very dynamic as a result of having a monument there, that this becomes an important marker, either negatively or positively, but the space around it becomes this space to gather, to either commemorate or to talk back. And they can be seized in such imaginative ways by the public. A couple years back, I interviewed the sculptor Alison Saar, who did a monument to Harriet Tubman in Harlem. And she talked about how the gardens around that monument have really become a space for like local students to do projects. You know, they've planted roses, they've planted cotton, they've done interesting things with that space. And it becomes, I think, much more pointed and meaningful because the statue of Tubman is there. So I think it could just be a garden. Students could have just worked in a garden, but the fact that the monument is there, the fact that they're tending to it, I think makes it more poignant and more significant.
That is one of my special places that I stop by regularly to have a moment. Thank you. Idris, how would you answer the question about why monuments matter in civic spaces?
Well, I definitely second everything folks have said so far. I mean, for me, monuments matter in civic spaces just because of the sheer power that they hold to shape our collective narratives and our consciousness. They provide opportunities to speak to our past, and they can serve as a connection between that past, present, and future. And I think they can actually be spaces of reflection, celebration, sometimes mourning, memorialization. They've, in my experience, have been gathering grounds to organize and be together within these public spaces. But the presence of monuments, I think, in a non-idealistic sense and in reality, or the absence of certain types of monuments have revealed like the progress or lack thereof and the erasure of these histories. I mean, for me, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, born and raised in Fort Greene, and I grew up in like a rapidly gentrifying New York City at the turn of the century. And I saw statues of oppressors like Christopher Columbus scattered throughout the city, and didn't see statues of people from my community. They were really absent. And so I have a tumultuous relationship with monuments because of the fact that they were communicating to me that my history wasn't worth celebrating, that my community's history wasn't worth celebrating. And so I do think that they can be flipped on their head to be have transformative power to challenge those dominant narratives and bring these untold stories to life. And my hope is that monuments can become a way for communities to contest these like pre-existing narratives and shift the authority and turn these civic spaces into dynamic, interactive spaces where history can be defined by the folks within the community and be catalysts for these conversations, learning, and societal change. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Idris, do you have a really specific memory of, in a little bit more detail, even of being a young person and feeling like this isn't speaking to me, or why that person, or this is missing?
Well, I think that, so again, going back to where I was growing up, I mean, monuments weren't really on my radar. Again, I didn't feel connected to them, didn't feel represented by them. But what I did feel connected to was history. And in Fort Greene, I mean, that was the center of like, I was a center for abolition in New York City and in Brooklyn. And that was the history that was passed down between my parents orally, my community. And I was living in the Underground Railroad space. And even if you go to Fort Greene Park, there's this prison ships martyr monument, which I would play around with all the time, jumping around. And I didn't really know that history until my family told me that it was where like the British prisoners were kept. And that was a place where those were being memorialized. But what they didn't tell you, when that monument doesn't dictate for anyone, is that a lot of those were Black enslaved folks who were buried underneath the park in the prison ships martyr. And so I think when going back to look online, there's not much of that history available. And so it's pretty clear for me that these histories need to be told, and these histories need to be like accessible and shared to everyone. So that's just one monument within my neighborhood that was extremely important for me, because it really showed me that inequity from the jump. Like, what are our public spaces not telling us? And let's hone in on that, because gentrification also is a large issue of that erasure. Like Fort Greene was a real community. I knew my neighbors. I knew my community on a very personal level. But now that there's that lack, as Amanda was talking about, that lack of respect for these spaces because these people didn't grow up in there. So knowing that history and sharing that within the public sector, the public realm is super important.
Thank you. Carol, why do monuments matter in civic spaces?
What Amanda, what you said really resonated for me. And Idris, you echoed that, where when I was young, I can only remember an experience with one monument that had any meaning for me whatsoever. And otherwise, it was just like totally irrelevant. And I think the conversation that was opened up during Black Lives Matter and movement, as that began to get underway, and during COVID, it all of a sudden, I think we all began to say, well, who's out there? Even for if you didn't have a visceral, sense of it's not me out there or someone, it doesn't represent me. There's still was sort of coming to say, well, who are these people? How were they chosen? And who do they represent? So, I mean, at one point in time, someone thought they were important, right? And so that symbolized for at least someone in the community who was important to the community, what was important to the community. I think the great thing about monuments can be is that they mark and they give special meaning to a space. As you were describing the Harriet Tubman space, I mean, what a beautiful sort of joining of, monument and meaning. And I think the best ones make you think. They can provoke. They elicit an emotion. And when that happens, I think they're doing their jobs.
How would, when we started this work at Mellon, a question that we were asked a lot was, what is a monument? What is a monument? What is a monument? And I think that most of us started out with the idea that a monument was perhaps that it was permanent, right? That it was made of steel or stone, or, that it was usually a single figure. And as it turns out, the research reveals, they are often people in acts of war. They are often single figures who enslaved other people. I mean, there are all these things that we know now. But thinking about the broader idea of what is a monument and what a monument can be. And each of you in very specific ways is here because you've thought really broadly about what a monument can be beyond what I've described. What's the essential way that you would describe a monument? Let's start with you, Carolina.
The easy questions, right? I think, under the best of circumstances, like I said, they are this marker, whether a figurative sculpture, a plaque, or something, a grove of trees that mark or commemorate or in some way acknowledge a significant person, place, or thing to that landscape. As Idris noted, they're also used as iconoclastic tools. They impose narratives on a place or on people. I grew up studying Latin American history. What did the Spanish do when they arrived in the Americas? They immediately tore down indigenous temples and built Spanish churches and other structures on top of them. An important form of iconoclasm. I'd also think it's worth noting that to me, there are kind of two very broad areas of monument that I'm interested in thinking about. And one is those that bubble up, and then there are those that are imposed for the top down, because they can be, coming from Latin America, I think of the roadside shrine that ends up taking on a kind of permanent status in a community, a meaningful tree where something happened. Those places can be so significant without any entity of a government or a civic authority saying this is a quote unquote monument. And I think it's important to acknowledge those as part of the debate, because it gives us a greater definition of monuments. And then certainly they're the ones that are imposed on the top down. And we've seen that, in California, the statues of Junípero Serra all over the South, the Confederate statues, the colonial statues, and they serve very different functions.
Idris, what is a monument?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a monument is a tangible like manifestation of that shared history in public space. I think through it's sort of a tribute to our collective memories and our values, but I think that it can be more than mere structures. It can be something that has a dynamic storytelling tool, again, to illuminate those narratives and conversations. And I think throughout history, like these monuments have been used to control those values, memory, and imagination. But I feel like the role of a monument that I would like to see is to be extended into that realm of imagination, identity formation, where they can really be tools for the community to uphold and show their values. I want a monument to be redefined as something more ordinary. There's like a Eurocentric perspective around monuments that's focused on marble, physical, figurative statues. But if we looked at other non-Eurocentric monuments, like a lot of indigenous communities consider the landscapes, mountains, monuments, buildings are monuments, really artifacts from that lived history have the opportunity to be monuments. And so I think a lot with my work is redefining what that monument can be and doing that from the bottom up so that archivists, scholars, and folks from the top down aren't always the ones determining what can be monumentalized, what can have that value, but having the people be able to decide that for themselves and be able to show that in a very public way and have them be stewards over the spaces that they inhabit and have built. So that would be my way to answer what is a monument?
Thank you. Amanda, how do you answer that question?
I love what Idris just said. I think I also skewed towards ideas about monumentality, or there's a bigness, and there also seems to be a kind of magic to it, or a way in which the monument is supposed to suggest, I don't know, some kind of like out of this world power or superiority, right? That I'm thinking in particular of Washington, D.C., like despite having statues and things that are called monuments, I think that first trip to DC when everything was white marble and, and so outside, like, Abraham Lincoln is like huge, so that really leaves an imprint about monumentality also needing to be large. And, you're not even sure how something like that is made at a certain age when you see something like that. And I do agree that I like this evolution of kind of expansion of what that could mean. And, lately I've really thought about, how we name things and how then the everyday becomes monumental in that way. And again, it's a secondary way that these stories are weaving in narratives that we either can embrace or kind of through osmosis are being embedded into our psyches, but what does it mean for one city to have 7 monuments to Columbus and a street and an elementary school and so I think people don't think about those things as monuments in the same way. How do we decide what gets named what and how that then translates? And so I think in addition to the things we might describe as monument writ large, there's also this way that a message of bigness or superiority or power ebbs and flows through the built environment through these other things that aren't physically large, but play a large role in our daily kind of existence. So I think for me, that's a lot of how I've been thinking about monument as I think through how to redefine or expand what that could mean for future generations.
I think also when you mention a city where there are all of the Columbuses, and that sometimes those are places probably where you're describing is somewhere where he never set foot. I think of an aspect of monuments as having something to do with making the ground speak, right? Having some relationship to the actual place where you are at the moment that you're experiencing the monument. I mean, no rules, they don't have to be, but I think it's very striking, the fictions that are created when you have people overrepresented in places where they never were. Carol, how do you answer the question?
Well, Ed was talking about values, right? And how monuments can convey values. We're thinking a lot about that with the new park that we're redeveloping. And at its simplest, it feels to me like it's something that marks a space in a way that says, you should care about this. And having that discussion, I think, is really interesting. Like, what is it we should care about? And how then does that manifest, in a monument or in a piece of art or in something more modest like a landform? But it's the what should we, that you should care about this is, and then of course, who, as Amanda said, who imposes that? But, if you could really get it right as a community and have that discussion, I think it'd be really very exciting. And that's a dream, but nonetheless, I think it's something worth striving for.
Well, I want to stay with you for a minute, especially because you're talking about the power to instruct, even when we're not necessarily conscious as consumers, that that's what's happening. We are being instructed. And I would love to hear, Carol, more about Tom Lee Park in Memphis. And you have some images for us, and it's opening September 2nd. So we would love to hear the history of Tom Lee Park, the story of Tom Lee, the messages in Theaster Gates's monument to listening, and what you're hoping for when this space opens. And we'll see some images too.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You did a pretty good job of summarizing things. This story is really
There's much more for you to say.
There's a lot more to say, and I won't say it all. But Tom Lee Park started as this very small spot of a park, differently named, that was at the foot of Beale Street and the riverfront. And the park was renamed in 1952, the year he died, for Tom Lee, who was a Black skiff boat operator who couldn't swim, who in 1925 saved 32 people from drowning in the Mississippi River when their ship capsized. And his courage and his selflessness at the time was celebrated both locally and nationally in a number of ways, including, again, the naming of this park after his death. And the park has been expanded twice, including to its current size of 31 acres in the early 90s. But by this time, most Memphians had forgotten who he was, if they ever knew his story. We talked about that earlier, generationally, the forgetfulness, and Amanda, you talked about that. And so what we're doing is we're using this opportunity of remaking the park, led by Studio Gang and Scape, our designers, to lift up his stories and the values, there's that word again, the values he embodied with his humanitarian act. And we think it's such a great opportunity to have a story and a set of values right at the beginning to inform the placemaking. So we commissioned, thanks to Mellon, we were able to commission artist Theaster Gates to produce what he terms an anti-monument. And it's titled, as Elizabeth said, A Monument to Listening. It's conceived as 32 functional sculptures. They are to be sat upon. He calls them thrones that span two areas of the park. In a quieter part of the park, they're made from honed basalt, and the 32 pieces, of course, represent the lives that Tom Lee saved. 28 of the sculptures are set they're positioned in a circular configuration within what we call the point of reflection. And then there are 4 sculptures that sit at the edge of the river alongside a taller throne, which is the only one that is polished. They are all black. And that is for a reason. They all have a little bit different surface treatment. And from the Astor's point of view, the Monument to Listening pays tribute to Tom Lee's legacy while also functioning, as he would say, a kind of corrective medicine for a world that would rather view passively than talk intentionally about the truths of race. And so his goal and ours is to create new opportunities for dialogue, inviting people who experience it to ask questions about each other, ask questions of each other, what you believe, how you want to imagine a new future for Memphis, how you might enact change in the world. So and we've had very few people have been able to see this, but we had a group of local creatives come in and see it last week at beautiful Golden Hour in the park. And they talked about how they could engage others, animate the work, really get the conversation started. And we are so excited about sort of not only having the sculpture, but adding that layer of engagement to the work in ways that, you've talked about other work being done, but having people feel like they instantly, the creatives that we assembled just instantly got it. They, kind of put their arms around it and said, we want to add a layer of meaning, our layers of meaning to this, which I thought was like perfect, just what we wanted.
Beautiful. Thank you. And now, Idris, you have been instrumental in imagining what commemorative works in cities can become far beyond steel, stone, and statues. So we'd love to see some of your recent work at Kinfolk and how you're trying to address the question of monuments in American cities.
Yeah, so at Kinfolk, we're definitely interested in how the digital space engages with monuments, with public spaces, the built environment. I like to say that at Kinfolk, we're building the archive of the future. We're trying to build an archive that is participatory, dynamic, shared, and we're really trying to harness the power of technology to colonize these public spaces and really just create access to monument making to communities who may not have had access to that. And so I think the technology we use is augmented reality, which allows you to superimpose digital experiences, 3D models, basically digital sculptures that can be brought into the built environment through your camera. I know people probably know Snapchat, where you do the face filters. So that's an example of what AR is, but there's not a lot of folks harnessing that technology for this specific purpose. And we think that it provides an opportunity to unearth layers of untold stories within that built environment. But it started in 2017. At that time in New York, Mayor de Blasio was just deciding what to do with the Christopher Columbus monument, whether to remove it, whether to make it a landmark, whether to add contextualization. We were advocating for the removal of the monument. And in order to do that, we wanted to gather folks, the community around the Columbus Circle Monument, create these AR narratives of the true story of Christopher Columbus, as well as the monuments like you see here of a proposal for General Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, to replace Christopher Columbus in the physical sense instead. And so that was the blossoming of Kinfolk. And from there, we really started to figure out that we could harness this power of digital monuments and storytelling to reimagine and take control of our public spaces. So I know a lot of people probably know Pokemon Go. It's an app where you can engage with Pokemon around the city in a location-based way. And for us, we're like, wait, there's so much history around us. Why don't we use that same technology so that we can work outside of traditional institutions to bring monuments and narratives to spaces where they might normally not be, as well as contextualize existing monuments that we may not agree with, but cannot get removed. And so practically what we're doing is we're creating digital monuments. And what started as us creating them sort of blossomed into us creating monuments across the country. Partially thanks to Mellon, we're able to go to different cities now and work in a very co-creative way that we can work really in a deep level with monuments, with community members. While building these monuments are important, I really feel like what we feel like is important, more important, is that the process of this community building. And so through this monuments co-creation process, we bring the community in on the onset of the creation of these monuments, even allowing community members to nominate monuments that they want to see. And then we work with local artists. We facilitate like a participatory approach where the community we're working with isn't just passive recipients of this information, but they're active contributors to this space. So again, we work with artists, local artists, historians, educators to really build this collective digital space that has art at the forefront, but also allows you to dive deep into the archive in space. So you can really learn about these figures. And it's a way to counteract the lack of nuance in physical monuments. This digital space allows us to extend that. And so a powerful recent example of ours is our collaboration with Project Say Something in Florence, Alabama. They were advocating to get the removal of the Confederate monument that exists in front of the courthouse there. So for Juneteenth, we did an activation where we utilized AR and co-created digital monuments with the community to highlight who they wanted to see. And that was Dred Scott. There was a monument to resistance on slave ships, and there was a monument to defying slave codes. And so these digital monuments, which we activated on Juneteenth, really served as that counter narrative to an existing Confederate statue. And we didn't really just want to keep letting that statue go unchallenged. And the AR brought a different element to life and really allowed us to redefine what we want to see in there. And so for us, it's important to create these monuments, but again, having that process and reevaluating that process is super important. And then finally, tying it to advocacy efforts is super important, because like our digital monuments aren't physical monuments, and they never will replace physical monuments. They're a way to create more access and really create more activations of history that's lost. But the end goal is to reshape our public spaces. And that is a lot of times in the physical sense and through policy change. So that's really we're in the intersection of a lot of different areas that we can help be bridges for folks to have access to tell stories about their history.
Very cool. Thank you. Amanda, as an artist trained as an architect, you have a very specific set of critical skills and skills and ways of thinking about reimagining public space that I think sort of inherently brings in how cultural and economic value intersects with race in the built environment. As you know, I am especially fond of your Colored Theory series. And the vacant and condemned houses that you engage with as monuments, many of which have now disappeared. So would love to hear some about that work, and also how you think about that neighborhood, Englewood on Chicago's South Side, and what it means to remember these buildings and spaces.
Yeah, I think, I didn't really think of them as monuments until we started making them and realizing that such a strong saturation or burst of color that then has cultural meanings related to them really were markers for people that made them live on beyond when they actually physically went away. So this is Flamin' Hots. This house was a mint green before we painted it. So it was this color for maybe 2 weeks before it was demolished. And the number of people that will say, oh, you mean where the orange house was? Or somehow reference this moment when, people collectively came and shrouded this piece of architecture that otherwise had been rendered invisible because of its kind of forced vacancy. For me, I think it also speaks to something that's really interesting about Idris's work, which is that we imagine, you go to architecture school, you imagine you're designing things that are going to live on forever. Nobody sits down and says, I'm going to design the thing that will end the community, but many of these were the very last piece of structure on a block. So they were the closure to what were vibrant places. And so these were very temporal monuments in that way. Somebody called them hospice. And so it was extremely powerful to imagine that people can have even a momentary positive association with a place that either they had a memory of and it was now gone, or they felt an injustice had been, had taken place through, the effects of redlining and contract buying and restrictive covenants and things like this. So I think for me to imagine these as something that can live on in a kind of memory, and in the way Idris is talking about, increasingly we'll be using other devices or thinking about things remotely or digitally to kind of bring that memory back, or to create it for the first time for people that don't have that longstanding understanding. I'd initially chosen Inglewood. I'm from Auburn Gresham, which is a kind of neighboring neighborhood that is very similar in many ways. But there was a national stain that was being placed on Inglewood as this, the kind of poster child for everything horrible and bad and dangerous. And I thought it was really important to not only honor that it had not been that and it is not that now, but also to give ideas about, what else is going on. So this rush of curiosity for these art installations also then reveals that there's all kinds of wonderful things, as we know, that are always going on in neighborhoods and communities, but are not necessarily getting the visibility or the platform. So in that way, their kind of oddity or the anomaly of seeing these things in this landscape also were able to attract attention or bring to the fore the idea that despite what the density or the lack thereof was happening, that these are actually places where there are beautiful moments of joy or beautiful memories for folks that grew up in these places, or that drive past all the time and can connect something about themselves to these spaces that look different than when they originally occupied them. So that was very different than what the intention was when I began, but I thought it's probably one of the most important kind of legacies of this work that I made intentionally to go away. So it really does bear the question of why the assumption or the need for things to live on in perpetuity, and what are ways that we can empower ourselves to take advantage of a kind of temporality that exists with this work.
And then, and this was work that you made. It wasn't commissioned work. It was work that you made, right? So I'd like to shift then to the commissioned and the figurative and the Shirley Chisholm monument that you've been working on.
That was just approved yesterday. Yay.
Yes, exactly. Newsflash.
After 4 years.
So we'd love to hear about creating that piece and yes.
Yeah, it's very different. Obviously, not only is it institutional, but it's going to be one of the first things that is meant to be permanent. And so that's a huge shift for me from this work that I make on purpose to kind of have a very temporary nature. This will be on the ocean and park side of Prospect Park in the entrance. So this is part of an initiative created by the former New York City administration called She Built New York City, in which they're going to monumentalize and memorialize five women who really shaped New York. So myself and Olale Conjefis, also known as Lake, my co-collaborator, were finalists and then were selected to create the first of these monuments. And so Lake likes to joke that we don't know a whole lot about cast bronze representational sculptures, but we do know a lot about making space. We both went to Cornell University together and studied architecture. And so we do have a sense of what an object can do in a field. And so there was no better person to honor than Shirley Chisholm for somebody that both kind of is outsized in their iconic image and the impact that they made, that she made in her lifetime and beyond, but then also a kind of selflessness and a desire to make sure that what her work was doing was bringing everybody to the table, whether people wanted it there or not. And so I think that we've done a great job of translating that with playing with scale. So from a distance along any of these vistas, you can see her as a beacon. And as you get closer, it's impossible to read her figure, and you are transported to the scale of the U.S. Capitol, which is one of the planes that intersects. And then on the ground is the semicircle of the seats of the Capitol. So that really it calls upon the idea of what it means to occupy seats of democracy and seats of power. So you can imagine this is a gathering place for rallies. This is also a great spot, to meet up, to walk with a friend through the park. So there are multiple layers and scales of the way that her message for all of us and her ambitions for what civic discourse could be will be rooted, right here. And so obviously then, as you said, my technical training then, comes back when you're thinking about materials that have to remain and materials that you want to evolve. And so polished bronze, or bronze that can be touched repeatedly, patinas, things that you would expect to wear over time, but also you can appreciate the beauty of, is something that we're really focusing on now that we move into this next phase of bringing this monument to life. So scale obviously is important in this sense. I talked about in the other instances, things that kind of ebb and flow very quietly or under the radar. It was really important for us that she really stand out, because that is who she was as a person. And so I think there's no reason for her to be diminutive. So we've really worked and listened to the community, to the stakeholders, to make sure that there's a balance. But it was important to not be apologetic or to minimize in order to create comfort. And so, it remains to be seen until it's a real thing that people interact with. But it was really important for us to make sure that in this case, monumental really meant something of grandeur in that way.
Beautiful, beautiful. Carolina, you've written in your piece on Robert E. Lee and others about the Confederate monuments, which I want to take as an example of monuments that represent harm, that cause harm, that enshrine people who have caused harm, that theoretically can become, gathering places around ideology of hatred and harm. Talk to us about your thoughts about that. And you mentioned Sarah, of course, as well.
It's that whole school of monument making is, it's really interesting to me, for the narratives, also because of the way, as somebody who writes about art a lot, the way a lot of those pieces were fabricated. I mean, they were almost like churned out on assembly lines and sent to disparate places. The monuments that of Spanish conquistadors and Latin American capitals were often produced in the same way. Somebody would come up with a cast, and many would be produced. I think what has been most interesting to me about this era in which those Confederate sculptures, and then in the case of California, the sculptures of Junipero Serra have come down, is the ways in which communities deal with that space in the immediate wake of the toppling, because that is very charged space. And to me, what has been most interesting is when those empty pedestals are allowed to just lie for a bit, allowed to sit there, allow communities to register that this was taken down, that it has been removed for a variety of reasons because of harm, that in many cases it was something that, say, that was done as a collective, as part of a community. And so the plinth of those monuments themselves can serve as these really, really interesting iconographies of this action that took place, this emptiness. I happened to be driving cross country in 2021 and happened to get to Charlottesville right after they had removed their statue of Lee by UVA. And in the case of Charlottesville, they had removed the statue, removed the plinth, put a fence around it. It might as well, for me as an outsider who had never been to Charlottesville, it could have been a construction site. It was one of those things that there wasn't really a palpable sense of what it was that had taken place there, both the erection of the monument, but also its removal. And I followed that up with Richmond and a number of other places. New Orleans, too, left its very incredible column on which the Lee monument stood. And I think that, there can be this reflexive action of the Lee statue has come down. Now let's put a statue of a woman in its place, or let's put a statue of an Indigenous person or a Black person. And I think part of this process, because monument building and I think monument removal is a process, to me, it's most compelling when people can kind of sit with those sites a little bit and really appreciate the action that it took to get it removed. I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but I think that's really what I've been thinking about. And then also, what are the ways in which artists can sometimes react to these spaces? There's like a great Dominican American artist named Joydy Minaya, who does these things where she wraps colonial statues in these fabrics made from illustrations from a colonial natural history books and creates these incredible forms. It's like she's reappropriating these spaces, and it becomes this really charged act of reclamation. And that is a very interesting process to me. And I think very important, because we can't just act like the monument was never there. We just can't. The monument was there. It represented what it represented, and it was not good. And so let's sit with that.
One of the things I've noticed when I've been to vacated plinths that is always so striking, they are big. I mean, they are really, really big spaces that allow you to think about the loom of what was there, the scale, and the fact that monuments can't go up or come down without collective action. So I think that that's an interesting aspect as well. And there is so much power. I love that, thinking about how alive and dynamic the space is after a removal. Carol, you said something that I loved about urbanism. You were asked a question about urbanism, and I want to just let this launch us into the potential for our collective spaces. You were asked, what would you like people to know about urbanism? And you said, urbanism is about people of all different types joyfully occupying the same space. So it means it needs to be dense. It needs to be walkable. It needs to be mixed use. It needs to be mixed income. It needs to be well served by something in addition to cars, and it needs to be welcoming to everyone. Urbanism sounds complicated, but it's really not complicated at all. It's just we don't do it enough. We don't do what we know has worked for hundreds of years. It's really no mystery at all. So what I love about that is just, the reminder and the vision of what does it mean to gather and share space in all of our multiplicity. Would anybody like to say something about, gathering space, potential, something that you have seen or dreamed of for how a monument can work and to serve that function?
I would love to butt in with it's a work of public art, maybe not technically a monument, but I guess I like to think of it as a monument. And I just happened to file a really big story about design and climate change, and sort of thinking of monument spaces as these intersectional spaces that have to serve a lot of purposes. So it may be the monument space also needs to be a park space. It needs to be a recreational space. It needs to serve. In the case of California, it probably needs to capture water when it rains. Like there's all of these different things that need to go on. And thinking about what Idris said earlier about the style of the bronze monument on the plinth, and that how that has been the vocabulary of the monument in Western society. there is this work in Santa Monica called California Wash. It was installed in 2020 by a couple of artists called the Harrisons, Helen Meyer Harrison and Newton Harrison, who did a lot of very ecologically minded works. And I really think of this, it's a project about water. I really think of it as a monument to water. And what it is it's this floor piece that runs along a stretch of boardwalk and sidewalk leading to this drainage cover where water from the Pico Coastal Wash all washes into the Santa Monica Bay. And it can be one of those pieces that you walk over 100 times and you don't notice it, but then one day you notice it. And what you're looking at is this aerial view of the map of every drop of water that leads to this one point that you happen to be standing on. And once you see it, like you can't unsee it. And it's very powerful. And thinking about all of the water problems that a place like Southern California has, it becomes this monument, I think, that again goes beyond the idea of the figurative monument to a single person, to a very important aspect of nature that is often taken for granted. And the design of it is so incredible because it takes up a lot of space, but you can walk on it, you can ride your bike on it, you can ride a skateboard on it, you can sit on it, you can walk your dog. Like it is not the roped off, fountain with the horse on top. It is really, they've created a space and you can use it in any way that you want.
That's amazing. I want to see it immediatly. Anybody else
cool.
want to
Once you see it,
it's
really incredible.
Yeah, about the potential of urbanism, the dream of urbanism.
I mean, I think Carol just said it so beautifully. I don't know if there's more to say, but
we should leave it unspoiled, perhaps.
Yes, I do think that one place having to be multiple things at the same time has always been alluring to me as an architect. And you're thinking about any kind of public space that has to read in that way. And so, again, I'm so struck with Idris's project in particular because, 5 people moving through the same space might have 5 different readings of it, not only just visually, or if you're visually impaired, you're looking at auditory or sensorial or kind of all these ways that you're trying to understand it, but also when you're talking about class or violence or narratives of stories of things that are happening or going on or multiple kinds of existences. I think for me, that's always been the alluring component of then adding this other layer of this inserted narrative, whether it's been imposed or whether it's kind of built up, as you said, bubbled up from the ground up. The most dynamic moments are when that insertion can also help expand all of those different readings at the same time. It's like everybody speaking a different language, but understanding it all at the same time. It's just so, there's something so seductive about that. As Carol said, if you get it right, then it's golden. So I think that is continually the aspiration for urbanism, but also for making work that has to live in public all the time.
We have so many fantastic questions from the audience, so I'm going to start with some of these. This one comes from Meg Galindo, who asks, I'm wondering if the panelists could address monuments of absence. I love how new monuments highlight undertold stories, but how do we commemorate the things forcibly forgotten that we might not be able to excavate even from the archives?
Just to say
please.
That question resonates for me because I when we started working on this park, one of the things that turned over and over my head is there's a quote on a plaque in the park from Alexis de Tocqueville, who happened to be in Memphis when and observing at the riverfront indigenous people waiting to cross the river on the Trail of Tears as a result of the Indian Removal Act signed by Andrew Jackson. The irony is Andrew Jackson is one of 3 founders of Memphis, and it was less than 10 years after he founded Memphis. signed the Indian Removal Act. And what de Tocqueville noticed about this was, I mean, what struck him was the silence, the absolute silence. And I've thought over and over, how might one express that silence and confront people with the silence, which I think is a sort of absence, right?
Yes.
And I haven't resolved that. Maybe that's the next project. Any takers on the call, let me know. But I do think that would be so powerful to be able to confront that silence. And again, that for me feels like an absence.
Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in? Idris, I think I see you leaning in.
I mean, I feel like silence has been, that resonates for me. Like silence has been something that I've been thinking about as well, and how this historical silence is really just intertwined with the fabric of our country. I know I was reading this book, Silencing the Past, which talks about how silence enters the process of historical production at like 4 different points. And it was like, there's the moment of fact creation, which is like the making of sources. There's the moment of the fact assembly, which is like the making of the archives, deciding what gets archived. There's the moment of like fact retrieval, which is like the making of narratives. And then the final one is like the moment of retrospective significance, which is the making of the history in that final instance, what's shown. And the silence really compounds over time and just gets worse. And that final portion, that retrospective significance, really that manifests for me in the sculptures, the monuments, the history books in the classrooms, historical stories and sites that we need to help identify, that we need to help form identity. But with that heavy compounded silence, these final narratives or monument productions are often mythic, individualistic, and inaccurate. And so I feel I go to City of Hartman in my brain right now with the critical fabulation that's like, let's fill in these gaps of history. There's a way to do it. It might not be in that traditional sense, but it's our duty to fill in these gaps in the archive in whichever way that we can. And oftentimes that maybe is imagination. That's maybe stepping into the speculative fiction area, and maybe away from more of those historical facts, but using those facts as a jumping point to dream and to imagine. And so I would say that there's always room for folks to fill in these gaps. And it's maybe not up to me. And let's have a conversation about it. Let's figure out how we fill in these gaps and what these specific gaps are. Everything can be figured out through conversation and discussion, which is the point for me of this monument space, is to catalyze these conversations.
Well,
that's
that
so
kind of
beautiful
actually. Oh, please.
No, I was going to say that's so beautiful, the way you just broke those moments down, because I think that I'm often mentally skipping over, and maybe lots of folks are not even thinking about. There has to be a moment of acknowledgement. So if there's been erasure or there's absence, when there's a recognition of something, or when someone is compelled to make sure that there's a recognition of something that is absent from a collective narrative, then there's the rupture. So I'm thinking in Chicago about the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial, which is one of 8 units that Mellon has founded with a recent grant to the city. This was a racist, horrible police officer who enacted, decades of torture on Black and brown bodies. And now finally there's going to be this memorial, and, in its kind of visage, it's very reflective and allows a kind of moment to acknowledge or bring forth, because people can't even contemplate or understand. The word torture is so uncomfortable for people, right? It's like, paired with justice, like the unsettling of that is critical as a kind of recognition and that rupture of the silence of like the scream in a certain kind of way, right? But also that it needs to be reparative, and it needs to wrap its arms around the people that it's been made in honor of, or to acknowledge this atrocity that's happened. But the acknowledgement has to happen, so once there's a understanding that there is an absence or a gap, just the moment of acknowledgement is so critical. I often want to just jump to, let's imagine what else, that's where my head lives most of the time. But I think it's important just to bring that into this conversation, that the way you broke down those those kind of components, I think there's also inherently an understanding that there has to be that acknowledgement for that shift, whether that silence needs to stay for a moment or whether there needs to be that scream or that kind of disruption of that silence in order to acknowledge what's been erased or what's tried to be kind of washed over.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that sort of slides into a question on the sort of other side. It's from Tess O'Dwyer at the Academy of American Poets. And it won't surprise you that the question is about words and language. Can you please discuss how we ought to rethink how language versus quotes, I would add names, could be a part of public monuments? So language and words and monuments. Who would like to think about that?
I mean, I feel like the first thing that comes to mind is certainly Maya Lin's Vietnam War memorial, because that was like such a key memorial in terms of using names as kind of the binding aesthetic element of the piece. I'm trying to, I think that piece continues to have this absolutely incredible power over the way and influence, this kind of land art driven pieces still have like an incredible amount of influence over how we are designing memorials today. I also think, as somebody who is about like the aesthetics of like symbols too, I think the second observation I just wanted to make was that one of the more remarkable monuments I've seen over the last few years is the monument to the enslaved workers who worked at UVA in Charlottesville, that was designed by Howler and Yoon and Mabel Wilson. And there was an artist involved, and I'm sorry, I forget his name. And what was interesting to me about that piece is that, speaking about recognition of absences, in many cases, they didn't have the names of many of the enslaved workers who worked on the campus. There was no way to acknowledge everybody. In some ways, people turned up on ledgers as numbers. And I think that monument does such a beautiful job of weaving together names and little texts and other elements with very simple markings intended to mark the unnamed laborers whose names, history may never recover. So kind of these symbolic articulations of these absences that we are just getting around to recognizing. I don't know if that answers your question, but those were the two things kind of kicking around my brain.
Yeah, and I would love to just add, I mean, you mentioned the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I have always thought that one of the ways that monuments have always existed for people who didn't have monuments in permanent form in public spaces is in the poetry of a culture. And certainly, in our poetry, as in our storytelling, our histories are kept safe and precious. We monumentalize because poems can never be destroyed. And that has been a way that we have taken a kind of an infinite space, actually, in the absence of public space. And I think about Yusef Komunyaka's amazing poem called Facing It. And he's a poet, African-American poet, Vietnam veteran, and he talks about going to the memorial for the first time as a veteran. And he starts, my black face fades, hiding inside the granite. I said I wouldn't, damn it, which is where the poem goes into the emotion of confrontation. And he, as only a poet as great as Komunyaka can, what he sees reflected, he talks about how many names and about people who are going to commune with and honor the names of people they knew, but also the names of people they do not know. And he said, I'm almost, this isn't his language exactly, sort of, I catch myself looking for my own name. I mean, think about all that is captured in that. And then he sees a hand reflected in the monument, and it said, "A woman is trying to erase the names." In other words, to make all this loss somehow not have happened. And then the poem ends, "No, she's brushing a child's hair." Great poem, Yusef Komunyakaa, Facing It. But, and so much held in the poem itself. So thank you for allowing me that public service announcement for great American poetry and monuments.
Here for it.
For me, if I may add.
Please add.
I think that, words and names have traditionally been how Black and Brown folks have really monumentalized our stories and our histories, is through that oral tradition. And I think words in themselves are extremely powerful. And that makes me think of some recent work that we did with Grow House, New York City, and Flatbush, Brooklyn. We created these counter monuments to challenge the unwanted presence of the city at this Flatbush ancestral burial ground. But before, the city was planning on building affordable housing on top of this empty lot, where they had discovered the bones of enslaved Africans that were under there. And a part of the work that was so amazing about what Grow House was doing was giving stories, like humanizing these figures that people just assumed were bones and were in the abyss. And the walking tours that she would do were so powerful because of the poetry, the storytelling, and how she brought these to life through words. I think it really allowed the people to dig in and feel like they knew what happened within the past. And that storytelling, doing so in place, is also pretty powerful. So for us, we just added monuments on top so that it can further humanize these elements. But the words and the audio in itself is super empowering. And I think, just highlighting that words of how we passed down and monumentalized our stories throughout for centuries.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. We are just about at time, and there are still so many incredible questions coming. So I just want to acknowledge all of the beautiful things that people are asking and thinking about, and say that we see it and it is feeding the energy of this conversation. And if we could just go around to close, what would you leave us with? A vision, a question, a conundrum, an idea, something beautiful. Let's start with Carol.
Well, Elizabeth, this is not beautiful, but one of the things that this conversation reminds me of is the society is so brittle right now. And, if we could again if we use the process that I think you have lifted up of the process of making monuments and decide collectively what we care about, what we want to pay attention to, what we don't want to repeat, and have that conversation on what we value in our communities. I think the notion that would end in some object, some piece of art, some physical something, maybe perhaps some digital something, but that the purpose, the conversation has purpose with a concrete result, I think would invite more people into what I think are very necessary conversations at this particular moment in time when things are so brittle and they are so conflicted, and all of the conflict is magnified so much with social media. And so that seems to me to be a really rich vein for this whole consideration of monuments.
Thank you so much. Amanda.
That was just so beautiful. I think, if I would leave with anything, it's that we continue to use, especially I'm thinking of my fellow artists, we use the work that we're doing to generate space for the conversations so that that we are slowing down and listening as much as we are trying to speak or be heard, so that it is expanded, and not just with people that we're in contestation with, but also people who, I'm thinking especially of the younger generation, who haven't been critical about these things yet, so that we are making space for curiosity, and for bravery and courage to have their opinion, and an opinion if it's different than other people, not only people that don't look like them, but people that sometimes do look like them. So for me, that's what I'm going to be thinking a lot about in terms of what the role of monuments can be in shaping the way we're changing or expanding how we all decide we want to coexist.
Thank you. Carolina.
Yeah, the process question is so incredible, and it's such the foundation of our monuments. That UVA monument to enslaved workers started off with a group of students saying, hey, let's look into the history of enslaved workers at our university. So sometimes those very preliminary conversations can lead to incredible physical manifestations down the line. But there was another, I figured I'd leave off since I'm an art writer. I'm so basic and just love the aesthetic piece. I was recently in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I saw this absolutely incredible monument that I just feel should be more on everybody's radar. And it is a piece by the sculptor named Jaime Suarez, and it's called Totem Telluric Totem. It was put up in 1992 for the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus. And, obviously this is very fraught history to be marking in a very prominent public plaza in Old San Juan. And I think the piece is just so remarkable for what it achieves at the level of material and the message that it sends, that even though the artist was being asked to commemorate essentially the beginnings of a genocide, he did it in such a way that evokes that history and still manages to be grand. And what he did is he created this very large pillar, almost like, the Trajan's column type monuments of ancient Rome. And he studded it with shards of pottery, which is a material obviously associated with indigenous craft, and that for a long time, was not taken seriously as a fine craft, by the world of fine arts. And it faces the Atlantic Ocean and the North. Puerto Rico is continues to be a U.S. colony. And Suarez said of it once, "A ceramic column totem rises like a monument to the clay and earth of the Americas, which in its vowels and fragments holds the secrets of who we are." And anyway, I think it's a remarkable piece. And if you're in San Juan, go see it for sure.
Thank you for that. Idris, what would you leave us with, my friend?
First off, I was going to say this earlier, but I live 2 blocks from the Shirley Chisholm location of the monument. So I'm really excited that that's going to bless my life at all times. So thank you for that. But for me, I guess I'll talk about the monuments I want to see, and then maybe some of the urgency here. But I really feel like, just to recap, for me, a monument is not a fixed or static thing, but it can be a living, evolving testament to our collective dreams, and it can be something that is temporal or ephemeral, or it can be something that is permanent. But I really think about how can we use monuments, and for me, technology, which is ironic, to really repair our community's relationship to nature, space, land. And I want this monument or public spaces to be something that is constantly redefined and recontextualized by its community. That's the most important part for me, is that we have agency and power over what goes within our spaces. And I would like the definition of monuments to be expanded to something or anything that creates space for gathering, storytelling, and dreaming. And so for me, how can we bring that to life? And I feel like, as Amanda said at the beginning, you weren't really bought in the monument stuff until 2020. And I feel like that's a common pattern. I mean, we're at a critical point in our history where the inner workings of the monument making public spaces and memory are becoming transparent. And the communities are recognizing that and putting pressure to make that happen. A little quick data that I realized is that like over the last since the George Floyd, 142 Confederate monuments have been removed, and then since 2015, there are about 72 others, like settlers in Columbus, that have been removed. But before that, only 5 monuments have been removed since 1865, and so I think it's clear that monuments are not really a part. Monument imagination and creation can be more a part of our culture. So how do we bring that to life, and how do we create spaces where that can be a participatory area for everyone to get involved with? So community is really what's important to me throughout this whole process.
Beautiful. Well, Idris, Carol, Carolina, Amanda, this has been a spectacular conversation. Thank you so very, very, very much. Thank you also to the literally thousands of people who joined our conversation and joined it so actively today. We appreciate your engagement, your questions, and your shared commitment to these ideas and this work. So we look forward to seeing you at future Mellon events, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye-bye.